Dr. Sarah Chin never believed in evil until she found the photograph that changed everything. The image stared back at her from her laptop screen at 2:47 a.m., a seemingly innocent childhood photo that made her blood run cold. After 3 years of studying criminal psychology, she thought she'd seen it all. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and leaned back in her cramped office chair. The university's criminology department had tasked her with analyzing childhood photographs of convicted serial killers for her doctoral dissertation. What started as academic curiosity had become an obsession that consumed her nights and haunted her dreams. She'd examined over 800 photos in the past 6 months, looking for patterns, for signs, for anything that might explain how innocent children became monsters. The photograph on her screen showed a 7-year-old boy at a birthday party. Tommy Morrison, who would later become known as the Riverside Strangler. But it wasn't Tommy that caught Sarah's attention. It was the other child in the background, partially hidden behind a balloon. A girl with dark pigtails and an unsettling smile that seemed too knowing for someone so young. Sarah's heart pounded as she cross-referenced the image with her database. This wasn't the first time she'd seen this girl. In fact, she'd spotted similar-looking children in 17 different photographs spanning 4 decades and multiple states. Different names, different families, different locations, but always the same haunting features and that same disturbing smile. Her hands trembled as she opened another file. There she was again, at a school carnival in 1987, standing behind Marcus Williams, later known as the Butcher of Birmingham. The girl looked identical to the one from Tommy's photo, taken in 1992. But that wasn't possible. The math didn't add up. Nobody could remain the same age for 15 years. Sarah pushed away from her desk and paced around her cluttered office. Coffee cups and research papers littered every surface, evidence of her growing obsession with this project. Her advisor, Dr. Peterson, had warned her about getting too invested in the psychological profiles. "You can't save the children they once were," he'd told her. "Focus on the data, not the emotions." But this felt different. This felt important. She returned to her computer and pulled up more files. The pattern became clearer with each image. The mysterious girl appeared in childhood photos of some of America's most notorious serial killers, spanning from 1982 to 2019, always in the background. Always watching. Always wearing that same unnerving expression that suggested she knew secrets no child should know. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her boyfriend Marcus. "Still at the office? You promised dinner." She glanced at the clock and realized she'd been working for 14 straight hours. Her relationship was suffering, her health was declining, and her friends had stopped calling months ago. But she couldn't stop now. Not when she was on the verge of discovering something that could change everything. She saved her work and gathered the printed photographs she'd been studying. 23 images now, each featuring the same impossible girl. Sarah tucked them into her briefcase, her mind racing with theories. Could it be multiple children who looked remarkably similar? Some kind of genetic anomaly that created a predisposition toward attracting dangerous individuals? Or was she losing her grip on reality after months of immersing herself in darkness? The drive home through the empty streets gave her time to think. Sarah had always prided herself on being logical, methodical, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be proven with data. But the evidence in her briefcase challenged everything she believed about possibility and coincidence. 23 serial killers, one mysterious girl, decades of impossible appearances. Her apartment felt cold and unwelcoming when she finally arrived. Marcus had left dinner in the fridge with a note that was more disappointed than angry. Sarah barely noticed. She spread the photographs across her dining room table and studied them under the bright overhead light. The girl's face seemed to watch her from every angle, those dark eyes holding secrets that made Sarah's skin crawl. She picked up the oldest photograph, dated 1982, showing the girl at what appeared to be a school playground. In the foreground, a young boy played on the swings. That boy would grow up to become Richard Crane, the interstate killer who claimed 47 victims across 12 states. Sarah had read his case files extensively. He described having a childhood friend who encouraged his violent fantasies, a girl who taught him that hurting others was natural and necessary. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she remembered Richard's testimony. He described his mysterious friend as ageless, appearing whenever he needed guidance in his darkest moments. The courts had dismissed his claims as the desperate lies of a man trying to avoid responsibility for his crimes. But what if they were wrong? The photograph slipped from Sarah's fingers and fluttered to the floor. She stared down at the girl's face, feeling as though those painted eyes were staring directly back at her. For the first time since beginning this research, Sarah wondered if she was in over her head. But she'd come too far to turn back now. She gathered the photos and locked them in her briefcase. Tomorrow, she would visit the university's archives and dig deeper into the histories of these killers. She would find rational explanations for what she was seeing. She had to, because the alternative was accepting that something impossible and terrifying had been hiding in plain sight for decades, watching and waiting and nurturing evil wherever it grew. Sarah turned off the lights and headed to bed, unaware that outside her apartment window, a small figure stood beneath the streetlight. The girl from the photograph smiled her knowing smile and disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the whisper of wind through empty trees. Sarah arrived at the university archives before they opened, clutching her coffee like a lifeline. 3 hours of restless sleep had done nothing to diminish her determination to find answers. The elderly archivist, Mrs. Patterson, unlocked the heavy doors and gave Sarah a concerned look. "You're here early again, dear. This research of yours, it's consuming you." Mrs. Patterson had worked at the university for 37 years and had seen countless graduate students lose themselves in their studies. But Sarah's obsession seemed different, more desperate and dangerous. Sarah forced a smile and headed straight to the restricted section where the most sensitive criminal case files were stored. Her faculty access allowed her to examine materials that the public would never see: police interviews, psychiatric evaluations, and personal correspondence from some of America's most notorious killers. Today, she was looking for any mention of the mysterious girl who seemed to appear in their childhood memories. The first file she pulled belonged to Marcus Williams, the butcher of Birmingham. His psychological evaluation mentioned recurring dreams about a childhood friend who taught him to enjoy others' pain. The interviewing psychiatrist had noted that Marcus became agitated when pressed for details about this friend, insisting she was real despite no evidence of her existence in school records or family photographs. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read the transcript. Marcus had described the girl exactly as she appeared in the photographs: dark pigtails, knowing smile, and an uncanny ability to appear whenever he felt angry or hurt. According to Marcus, she would whisper suggestions about how to make others feel the same pain he experienced. The psychiatrist had dismissed these claims as manifestations of Marcus's fractured psyche, attempting to externalize responsibility for his actions. But Sarah knew better now. She'd seen the girl's face too many times to dismiss her as delusion. The next file proved even more disturbing. Jennifer Walsh, known as the Angel of Mercy for poisoning 12 patients in her care, had written extensively about her childhood companion in letters to her sister. Jennifer described a girl who appeared during her loneliest moments, always offering comfort and understanding. This friend taught Jennifer that ending suffering was an act of kindness, that death could be a gift to those who were hurting. Sarah photographed the relevant pages with shaking hands. Jennifer's descriptions matched the others perfectly, down to the girl's habit of tilting her head slightly when she smiled. But Jennifer had been born in 1971, making her a child in the 1980s. How could she have known the same girl who appeared in Richard Crane's life during the 1970s? Hours passed as Sarah dove deeper into the files. Each killer's story contained references to their mysterious childhood friend. Some were subtle mentions in therapy sessions. Others were detailed journals describing conversations with their companion. All painted the same picture of a girl who encouraged violence while offering emotional support to lonely, damaged children. The most chilling discovery came from David Park, the suburban slasher who terrorized California in the early 2000s. David had kept a childhood diary that police confiscated after his arrest. Sarah read his entries with growing horror as he described meeting his new friend at age 8, shortly after his parents' messy divorce. The girl understood his anger and taught him games involving hurting small animals. She promised him that someday he would be powerful enough to hurt the people who had hurt him. David's final diary entry, written just before his first human kill at age 19, contained a drawing of his friend. Sarah stared at the crude sketch with her heart pounding. Despite David's limited artistic skills, the resemblance to the girl in the photographs was unmistakable. Sarah's phone rang, startling her from her research trance. Dr. Peterson's name appeared on the screen, and she reluctantly answered. "Sarah, you missed your morning classes. Students are asking questions." His voice carried concern mixed with professional frustration. "This dissertation is important, but you can't let it destroy your career before it starts." "I'm on to something big," Sarah whispered, glancing around the empty archive room. These killers all had the same childhood friend. The same girl appears in their photographs spanning decades. It's impossible, but it's happening. Dr. Peterson sighed heavily. Sarah, you're seeing patterns that don't exist because you want them to exist. It's called apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. You need to step back and approach this objectively. But Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Dr. Peterson had been studying criminal psychology for 25 years, and he'd never encountered anything like what Sarah was describing. After she hung up, Sarah returned to the files with renewed determination. If her mentor couldn't explain what she was finding, then she needed to dig deeper. The afternoon brought another breakthrough. Police interviews with family members of various killers revealed a disturbing pattern. Parents and siblings consistently mentioned a strange child who would play with their troubled family member. This child never gave a last name, never seemed to have parents or a home address, and always disappeared when adults tried to learn more about her. Mrs. Rodriguez, mother of convicted killer Antonio Vega, had told police about her son's imaginary friend who seemed too real. She would come to our house, eat our food, play in Antonio's room. But when I asked where she lived, Antonio would get angry and say I wouldn't understand. Then one day, she just stopped coming. That's when Antonio started getting into real trouble. Sarah realized she was no longer looking for a person who appeared in photographs. She was tracking something that had been physically present in these children's lives, influencing them during their most formative years. The photographs were proof of her existence, but they were just the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying truth. As closing time approached, Sarah reluctantly gathered her materials. She had enough evidence to know that something unprecedented was happening, but not enough to understand what or why. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous part of her investigation, trying to find the girl herself. Walking to her car in the dim parking lot, Sarah felt eyes watching her from the shadows between streetlights. She quickened her pace, her research materials clutched tightly against her chest. Somewhere in the darkness, she could swear she heard the sound of a child's laughter, soft and knowing and filled with ancient malevolence. Sarah spent the next morning creating a map on her apartment wall, marking locations where the mysterious girl had been photographed over 4 decades. Red pens scattered across the United States told a story of impossible mobility and timing. Phoenix in 1983, Detroit in 1987, Miami in 1994, Seattle in 1999, and dozens more. No ordinary person could have traveled such distances while remaining physically unchanged. Her doorbell rang at exactly noon. Marcus stood outside with grocery bags and a determined expression. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past her into the apartment. He stopped short when he saw the wall covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and colored string connecting various pins. "Jesus, Sarah, what is all this?" Sarah felt a mix of relief and terror at finally sharing her discovery. She walked Marcus through her findings methodically, watching his expression change from skepticism to concern to something approaching fear. When she finished, he sat heavily on her couch and stared at the wall of evidence. "You realize how this sounds, right?" Marcus said finally. "You're talking about something supernatural. Some kind of entity that's been influencing serial killers for decades. That's not psychology, Sarah. That's horror movie stuff." But Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. Marcus was a rational man, an accountant who lived his life by numbers and facts. Yet the evidence she'd presented was overwhelming in its consistency and detail. He wanted to dismiss it, but he couldn't explain away what she'd discovered. "I need to find her," Sarah said quietly. "I need to understand what she is and why she does this. These killers, they were just children when they met her. Damaged children who needed help, and instead they found something that nurtured their worst impulses." Marcus shook his head. "Even if everything you're saying is true, how do you find something like that? She's been evading detection for 40 years. What makes you think you can succeed where police and federal investigators have failed?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing. Then she remembered something from David Park's diary entries. He'd mentioned specific locations where his friend would meet him. Abandoned places where children felt safe to hide from adult supervision. Old playgrounds, empty lots, derelict buildings. Places where lonely, troubled kids naturally gravitated when they needed to escape. "She finds them when they're most vulnerable," Sarah explained. "Children who are isolated, angry, or hurting. They seek out places where adults won't follow. If I can identify those locations in areas where killers lived as children, maybe I can establish a pattern." The research consumed the next 3 days. Sarah cross-referenced childhood addresses of convicted killers with local records of abandoned properties, closed schools, and demolished buildings. A pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. In every case, the future killers had lived within walking distance of places that would naturally attract troubled children seeking solitude. More disturbing was the discovery that many of these locations had been sites of unexplained tragedies involving children. Accidents, disappearances, and deaths that local authorities had never been able to fully explain. The girl wasn't just influencing potential killers. She was drawn to places where childhood innocence had already been damaged or destroyed. Sarah's obsession deepened as she realized the scope of what she was investigating. This wasn't just about serial killers. This was about something ancient and malevolent that fed on corrupted innocence and nurtured evil wherever it could take root. The serial killers were just the most visible symptoms of a much larger infection. Dr. Peterson called repeatedly, but Sarah ignored his messages. She'd stopped attending classes entirely, spending every waking moment tracking the girl's movements through decades of tragedy. Marcus tried to maintain normalcy, bringing her food and forcing her to rest. But he could see his girlfriend disappearing into an obsession that was consuming her sanity. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening while Sarah was researching the childhood of Rebecca Torres, the schoolyard strangler who had killed 6 children in the 1990s. Rebecca's hometown had recently digitized their local newspaper archives, and Sarah found something that made her heart stop. A photograph from 1987 showed local children playing in Riverside Park, shortly before the old playground equipment was scheduled for removal. In the background, barely visible among the trees, stood the familiar figure with dark pigtails. But this time she wasn't alone. 2 other children flanked her, both with the same ageless features and knowing expressions. The caption identified them as visiting relatives of local families, though no families had claimed them when the newspaper tried to follow up for a larger story. Sarah realized she'd been looking at this wrong. There wasn't one mysterious girl influencing killers across the country. There were multiple entities, perhaps dozens, all working toward the same goal of nurturing evil in vulnerable children. The photographs had shown only one at a time, but they were part of something larger and more organized. That night, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. She would travel to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where 14-year-old Kevin James had recently been arrested for torturing animals. According to news reports, Kevin claimed to have learned his techniques from a new friend who understood his anger. If Sarah was right, one of the entities was currently active in Millbrook, grooming another potential killer. She packed her research materials and photography equipment, leaving Marcus a note explaining her plans. He would try to stop her if she told him directly, but she couldn't wait any longer. Each day that passed meant another damaged child falling under the influence of these creatures. Another future killer being shaped and molded for purposes she couldn't yet comprehend. The drive to Millbrook took 4 hours through increasingly rural countryside. Sarah checked into a motel on the outskirts of town and spent the evening studying maps and property records. Tomorrow, she would begin searching for the places where troubled children naturally gathered. She would find the girl, or whatever she really was, and finally get the answers that had consumed her life. As she fell asleep in the unfamiliar motel room, Sarah didn't notice the small figure watching from across the parking lot. The entity had been aware of Sarah's research from the beginning, amused by the psychologist's desperate search for rational explanations. Now, Sarah was coming directly to her, saving the entity considerable effort. Some gifts, she reflected with ancient patience, delivered themselves. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of children's laughter echoing across the motel parking lot. She peered through the curtains, but saw only empty pavement under flickering streetlights. The laughter continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, until she wondered if she was losing her grip on reality. Her 3 months of obsessive research had taken a toll on her mental health, and the isolation wasn't helping. She dressed quickly and drove into Millbrook's downtown area. The small Pennsylvania town looked like countless others she'd studied, working-class neighborhoods surrounding, a decaying industrial center, the kind of place where children grew up feeling forgotten and angry. Perfect hunting grounds for entities that fed on corrupted innocence. Sarah's first stop was the public library, where she researched recent incidents involving local children. Kevin James wasn't the only troubled youth in Millbrook. Over the past 6 months, there had been reports of animal cruelty, vandalism, and increasingly violent behavior among the town's preteen population. School counselors were overwhelmed, parents were worried, and local authorities were baffled by the sudden spike in disturbing incidents. The pattern was accelerating. Whatever was happening in Millbrook was reaching a critical point. Sarah spent the morning visiting locations where troubled children might gather. The old rail yard, a defunct shopping center, the abandoned Millbrook Elementary School that had closed due to budget cuts 3 years earlier. At each location, she felt a presence watching her, something ancient and patient that found her search amusing rather than threatening. It wasn't until she reached Riverside Cemetery that Sarah found what she was looking for. The graveyard bordered the town's poorest neighborhood, and local children had worn paths through its grounds as shortcuts to school. Among the weathered headstones, Sarah spotted fresh disturbances, small clearings where someone had been sitting, candy wrappers scattered around makeshift gathering spots, and carved symbols on several monuments that made her skin crawl. The symbols weren't random vandalism. They formed patterns that suggested ritual significance, as if someone was teaching children to transform their anger and pain into something more focused and deliberate. Sarah photographed everything, her hands trembling as she recognized the sophistication behind what appeared to be childish destruction. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah positioned herself behind a large mausoleum and waited. Her research had taught her that these entities operated according to patterns and schedules, appearing when vulnerable children needed them most. In small towns like Millbrook, that meant after school hours when kids sought refuge from troubled homes and uncertain futures. The first child arrived at sunset. Tommy, according to the name carved into a nearby tree, couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He carried a backpack and moved with the cautious awareness of someone who'd learned not to trust adults. Tommy selected a spot near the back of the cemetery and sat among the headstones, looking lost and angry and perfectly vulnerable. Sarah held her breath as a figure emerged from behind a cluster of trees. The girl from her photographs walked toward Tommy with familiar confidence, her dark pigtails catching the fading sunlight. But seeing her in person revealed details that photographs couldn't capture. She moved with fluid grace that seemed unnatural for a child, and her eyes held knowledge that no human child should possess. "Hello, Tommy," the girl said, her voice carrying across the silent graveyard. "You look sad again. Did your father hurt you today?" Tommy nodded miserably, and Sarah watched in horror as the girl sat beside him with practiced compassion. She spoke softly about understanding pain and anger, about how adults deserve to suffer for hurting children, about games that could make Tommy feel powerful instead of helpless. Sarah knew she was witnessing the precise moment when another potential killer was being shaped and molded. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to save this child from the corruption being whispered into his eager ears. But she needed to understand what she was dealing with before she could hope to stop it. The girl's head turned sharply in Sarah's direction, though Sarah was certain she'd remained hidden. Those ancient eyes met hers across the graveyard, and a smile spread across the girl's face that was both childlike and utterly malevolent. "We have a visitor, Tommy," the girl said without breaking eye contact with Sarah. "Someone who's been very curious about my work. Should we invite her to join us?" Terror flooded Sarah's system as she realized she'd been detected. The entity had known about her research from the beginning, had been allowing her to get closer, perhaps even guiding her investigation toward this moment. Sarah was no longer the hunter. She was the prey. Tommy looked confused as the girl stood and began walking towards Sarah's hiding spot. "Dr. Sarah Chen," the entity called out, her voice echoing strangely among the headstones. "You've traveled so far to find me. You've sacrificed your career, your relationships, your sanity to understand what I am. Don't you want to meet me properly?" Sarah stepped out from behind the mausoleum, her camera clutched in shaking hands. The girl stopped just a few feet away, and Sarah could see that her face wasn't quite right. The proportions were subtly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate human features from memory rather than understanding. "What are you?" Sarah whispered. The girl tilted her head with that familiar gesture Sarah had seen in dozens of photographs. "I'm what children need when their innocence is already broken. I'm what grows in the spaces where love should have lived. I'm what you humans create when you abandon your young to darkness and despair." Behind them, Tommy watched with growing excitement. The girl gestured for him to approach, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that she was about to become part of the entity's lesson plan. Her research, her obsession, her desperate search for truth had led her directly into becoming another tool for corrupting innocence. "You wanted to understand how killers are made," the girl said, placing one impossibly cold hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Let me show you." The sun disappeared behind the trees, plunging the cemetery into darkness. In that darkness, Sarah finally understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess, and some truths too terrible to survive. Share this story if it gave you chills, and subscribe for more psychological thrillers that will keep you awake at night. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Comment below and let's discuss the terrifying psychology of evil.